What up, everybody? Hope everybody is well. Today we're going to be going over some dope topics in JavaScript. I call it JavaScript Jawns. So I'm excited to get into a little bit more of this content.
What's up, Professor? Good evening.
Nice. So get my bearings and we get started in a few. Shout out everybody. Cool. What's up, everybody? Curious how y'all feeling. So if you can, drop in the chat 1 through 5, how your day been going. Feeling it. Love to see some 5s, love to see some 1s, depending on how it's going. Okay. I'm seeing the numbers rolling. That's what's up. Okay, we like averagely positive. We're average and positive out here. I mess with it. That's what's up. Oh no. Got some folks saying 2. What happened, fam? What's going on? Talking about 2. You gotta know. Nice. Where y'all? Well, this is my first time live streaming my class, so I'm excited but also nervous. Dang, moving heavy things around in a very tight spot the whole day. Dang, bro. I hope that you can rest after all of this. You know what I'm saying? Either not. It's not gonna happen. Dang. All right, well, hopefully today's class ain't too stressful and we just keep it rocking. Cool. Let a couple more people join on and we're gonna get going. All right. All right. Yeah, I'll give it like 3 more minutes and we get started. Glad to see that everybody, for the most part, is feeling good. Thank y'all for hopping on here. And yeah, basically today, what I wanted to talk about is just some fundamental JavaScript stuff, getting that going, and making sure that y'all feel like you can feel comfortable working with the JavaScript programming language. And so whenever you learn a new language, it can be kind of an interesting process, especially if you've never really learned a language. So I know for some of y'all, this might be your first time getting into JavaScript. For others of y'all, this might be like new language. Second language, but you've already kind of learned one. So we'll try to go through the basics as best as we can, but at the same time, we will do it in a way, hopefully, that allows everybody to get good with the content. Some folks asking how I'm doing. I'm doing good. Yeah, it's been a good day. You know what I mean? Got my green juice out here, trying to live a healthy life. And yeah, I'm trying my best now to keep the content around longer so that y'all can definitely take part in listening back. So I'm streaming some of this class on YouTube right now, which is kind of a big deal because I don't really be doing that. You know what I'm saying? I'm like, well, I be like low key. I be low key in the cut with my tech teaching. So it's cool to put it up for more people to take a look at, and for y'all to take a look at after class. So yeah, I'm excited, but I'm glad to be here. You already know. Thanks, y'all. See some claps. I appreciate y'all. That's what's up.
Yeah, I meant to raise my hand. I want to ask, which IDE do you use for JavaScript?
Hey
Which one do you
man,
prefer?
we about to go all up in that. So as far as IDEs go, I like to technically I end up using one simple text editor called VS Code. I personally recommend VS Code, and I'll go over a little bit of why in a little bit, but I'm just going to kind of show y'all, with JavaScript, you don't need an entire IDE to use it, unlike working with like Java or other like more robust programming languages. You can use just a simple text editor to start working with JavaScript, which is pretty cool. VS Code comes with a lot of dope extensions and additional features and tools that make it very cool to use when you're programming with JavaScript, and it supports a number of other languages too. So it ends up being like kind of like, it's like one of those things you started with it and it's like, oh, I stick with it because it does exactly what I need to do. I'm curious for y'all in the chat. I see my man Eric said that he uses VS Code, but which text editor do y'all use? If you don't have one of preference, I definitely would say VS Code. A lot of people like Atom, Sublime Text. I used to use Sublime Text a lot, but then I started using VS Code and I haven't looked back. I have not looked back. Welcome everybody. Word. Cool. All right. Dope. All right, cool. We're getting up there in numbers. Got like 30, 36 so folks in here. All right, cool. So let's kind of get it going and talk about some cool. These are not why no Vim. Oh man, a lot of reasons. Mostly because I've never learned how to make it happen. Every time I go in Vim, I get confused. I'm like, insert, escape, where am I at? Yeah, VS Code is pretty cool. It just streamlines the process. Word. Yo, shameless plug. Shout out my sister Jasmine. See you in the chat, sister. You know what I'm saying? It's nice to see you. We out here. All right, cool. So, like I mentioned, today, today I want to kind of go over JavaScript stuff and really kind of get y'all thinking about like the fundamentals and really feeling like you can get up to speed with how the JavaScript programming language works. I know for most of y'all probably watching this, you are either new to JavaScript and this is kind of like your first time, or you know another programming language and you're trying to switch over to JavaScript, which also is cool. JavaScript is a pretty dope language to work with. I personally enjoy it because of readability. I feel like it's pretty easy to read to a degree, and when you code with best practices. But then also, it's such a versatile language. Like we talked about last class, we really got into what the difference is between working on the front end versus working on the back end. And JavaScript is one of those languages that you can use across the front end and the back end. And so I just wanted to start off with like kind of just like a review of what we talked about, just to make it make sense why we want to use JavaScript and what it would be useful for. And then taking that into kind of like, our first introduction to the JavaScript syntax and how to use it and whatnot. So I'm gonna pull up the slides that we took a look at last class, my well-designed web dev slides. And we'll start off with that and then transition into some more JavaScript topics. So share my screen real quick. Yeah. So last class, we started talking about like understanding the web and web development, right? And I told y'all that this is a topic that's really important for any web developer to know, because at the end of the day, you want to be familiar with the platform that you're working in, right? And the web is just this very expansive tool that is useful in so many contexts, but has such a it's such a robust tool that it can be kind of complicated, right? So we started talking a little bit more about demystifying what the difference is between the web and the internet, and figuring out like more about like how the web works in general. We talked a little bit about HTTP. We talked about client side versus server side programming, and then we spoke a bit about the role of someone who's a modern web developer. Like, what would a modern web? What is like somebody who's working on web development code today? And what would be important for them to know, right? And so, you know, just a little bit of a review. We asked, what is the difference between the web and the internet? And I want y'all to reflect a little bit. And if you can, drop some notes in the chat. If you remember, what would you say is the difference between the web and the internet now that we've kind of gone over it? Just ask yourself for it for a second. And if anybody wants to try to take a stab at answering, feel free to come off mute. It's all good. Word. Everybody like, hey, you the teacher, you're supposed to let us know. I got you. So so we talked last class about the difference between the web and the internet, and realized that there is a difference, right? So normally people like to conflate these two things. And I mentioned, like, in my prior experience, I didn't necessarily know that there was a difference between the web and the internet. If had you asked me like months ago, years ago, like, oh, Cam, what's the difference between the web and the internet? I would have been like, yo, like, I would have had to sit and think about it for a bit, right? And it's really important to clarify kind of this distinction so that people can understand how expansive the internet is, but what specifically the web is responsible for. I see a couple folks dropping stuff in the chat. Appreciate that. Essentially, the difference between the web and the internet comes down to the entire infrastructure, right? We talked about the internet is this global network of computer networks that rely on the TCP over IP protocol to communicate. It uses a number of data transfer mechanisms, but the TCP over IP protocol is the main mechanism that allows for internet connectivity and networking to occur. There's a number of different ways that we can transfer information over the internet, such as the file transfer protocol, the secure shell, and HTTP, to just name a few. And the interesting thing about the internet is that it connects computers in a number of different formats, right? It connects us to computers over Wi-Fi connections. It connects us to computers over dial-up connections, over cellular connections, or even satellite connections, and even Bluetooth, right? The internet is, as some folks mentioned in the last class, like this information highway, right? That connects different networks together. It is made up of a number of hardware resources, right? So there's cables and there's all types of fiber optics nowadays, right? That connects us and connects these networks to each other. But at the same time, there's a number of different tools and resources in the software sense that allow for the computer to end up doing this networking with other computers. We mentioned you probably can't remember a time before the internet, right? Because the projects were started in the late 50s and the early 60s. And the idea of connecting two computers in completely different locations is a big idea, in that it allows for us to connect in this data-oriented sense with all over the place, right? the web, right, or the World Wide Web for in longer form, is one specific method for transmitting and receiving data over the internet, right? So the web itself is using the infrastructure that is the internet in order to allow for us to transmit and receive data, right? And we took a look at how that happens and how that occurs. We talked about the first ever website that was created by Sir Tim Berners-Lee and his team at CERN, as researchers who were trying to figure out how to connect their laboratory to other research, academic research labs around the country and around the world, and using the WWW framework to allow for the transmission of what they called hypermedia or hypertext. And one other aspect of allowing for that transfer to occur was by way of using what were called uniform resource locators, or URLs, to basically clarify, hey, here's the path to this specific file on this machine. If you think about a URL, right, when you go to www.mysite.com / about us / whatever, right, you're directing the user to a specific path of your website, or in a computer sense, you're directing them to a specific path on that server that would allow for them to find a resource that they're looking for, right? And so that's what a URL is in general. It's a uniform resource locator. We use URLs for local files, and we use them also for files that are stored externally, like on an actual website. And the biggest thing to take away is that the web is not the same as the internet, right? When we talk about the internet, we're talking about the entire network of networks that connects us as computer users. We talk about the web, we're talking specifically about transmitting information over the internet using the HTTP protocol. And that's the difference, and that's what's important here. So then we talked a little bit about how does the web work, right? How does it work when I go to a new website, when I go to google.com or github.com and just go into my browser, type in google.com and press enter, what happens? And we talked about how we make a connection through our internet service provider to the remote server of those different web domains, right? So those addresses, google.com or github.com, are called domains, web domains, and they're addresses. And you could think about the what happens next as a system of looking up the corresponding phone number for that address, right? So what's called the domain name system is a system that allows for computers to look up the IP address of specific servers based on some identification, some like the web domain or the name, right? It's essentially the same process of like looking up somebody's username and saying, oh, like I'm trying to look up Joe, and I know their username, but I need their number so I can contact them. That's essentially what happens behind the scenes of our computers when we use the domain name system service. And when we go to a website, essentially what's happening in the background is we're making a request to that server with the IP address that we get back, and we try to make a connection. We try to establish a connection with that computer, and whether the connection is accepted, it's acknowledged, and it's authenticated and approved, we might get back some type of a response of data, or some error that lets us know, hey, this was the error that came up when you tried to request the resources at that specific machine. So what's important to say is every time we're using the web, we're making connections between two computers. And that connection, that process of making and establishing a connection is important in how it works, because without the IP address, without the DNS, we wouldn't be able to establish these connections with other machines, because our computer doesn't know who google.com is. They just know Google's IP address, or they know the IP address to reach Google. And also, if we didn't have that specific address, we couldn't make a request that would allow us to get back information, because we're processing those requests through specific internet protocols that rely on establishing those connections before transmitting any type of data. The web server, after we make a connection, sends back some information. And we talked about how that entire process is what is known as the hypertext transfer protocol in the web-based sense, right? After the web, we make the request. we're trying to get back information from a particular server, then the server responds. That process is established through the hypertext transfer protocol, which is this cycle of requests and responses that happen between clients and servers. In general, clients are machines or like personal computers that are making a connection request, sorry to use the word again, to a different computer, right? Servers are thought of as computers that are receiving that request and then processing a response back to another computer. So a question that you get asked a lot during interviews is something like, what's the difference between a client and a server, or what can any computer be a server? And the question is, the answer really is yes, but some computers are better at being servers than other computers. And we talked a little bit about why that's the case, because servers got to be on and, you know, able to be reached all the time. Whereas, you know, I want to turn my MacBook off at certain moments because it makes sense to turn it off. The HTTP process relies on these requests that we make and these responses that we get back in return. Both are just transmitting some data between the computers. And what's interesting is that the response can contain some specific types of data that do interesting things when it comes back to the client. And some of that can be code, some of it can be images, media, all the hypertext that we talked about, hypermedia and whatnot that we talked about when we looked up the origins of the web with Sir Tim Berners-Lee and whatnot. We talked about the different types of methods, HTTP methods and protocols, HTTP verbs, excuse me, that we can use to interact with data. We talked about the GET request, which is about getting data or reading data from somewhere. The POST request, which is about pushing data into another server, so inserting data somewhere. Put and patch, which really is all about updating some data. And then delete, which is a HTTP method for deleting data. And then lastly, we talked about status codes, right? And talked about how if every request has a specific method, every response has a status code. So based on whatever request you put in, you get back a response from the server that says something about how that request got processed. Was it successful? And if so, we get like a 200 level status. If it had to redirect to another page, we get back a 300 level process. If it was an error, we get a 400 level process. And if it was a server error, meaning a server crash or something, and like the problem is on Google's side or the problem's on Amazon side because their servers crashed, we would get back like a 500 level error. Most times when we get errors on our computer, we see like 404 when it's like, you know, server not found or something, like we typed in the name wrong or our internet's missed, we don't have an internet connection. So we get a 400 level error. But if something is if everything's working as expected, we're getting 200 level errors, 200 level statuses, which are great. Dope. And that leads us to this big piece, which remember I told y'all, I was like, I know y'all are probably wondering like, what is the purpose of me asking or talking about all of these things before we talk about JavaScript or before we talk about React? And the reason why is so that you can understand really what the difference is between the client side and the server side, which is a really important distinction to be making early into your career as a web developer, so that you're aware of like kind of what's going on, right? So client side refers to all web application actions that are taking place on the end user or the client's computer. We say the end user because that's the user that's actually going to be on their computer, typing something and making a request to another server, right? Server side refers to the actions that take place after that request has been processed. So a server would receive the processed request and then do something with it. They would run some code or, you know, parse the request to get back some information and do something based on things like what method did they use? Are they trying to read some data? And then the server's like, okay, cool, here's the data. Or are they trying to post some data? It's like, oh, let's take the information you want to post and I'll do something with it, right? And so on and so forth. But making this distinction between client side and server side is important because it impacts what you would be doing if you were working as a web developer, right? So we hear a lot of web devs talking about, I like front-end development, which is basically saying that they appreciate working on code that affects what the client sees, versus back-end developers who are like, hey, you know, I'm not really as motivated in those types of interactions, but I'm more in like the user interactions. I'm more interested in the data processing that happens when we're making requests and sending responses back to other applications, right? And those two things are different, right? As a full stack developer, you'd be responsible for both of these pieces. And where React and JavaScript come into this is JavaScript is a language that can be used both on the client side and on the server side. So I just want y'all to remember that as we start talking about it. We're more going to go into syntax and more of the basics, but all of what we're going to be doing for the next couple of weeks is taking the knowledge of the fundamentals of JavaScript and then applying it in these contexts. We're definitely going to be focused more on the client side and learning how to use JavaScript and for the front end and building out code that allows for JavaScript to run on the front end. And we'll talk about React as a library that makes front end development with JavaScript easier. But also, you know, we might touch on JavaScript on the server side and talking about the back end and how you can use JavaScript as well in that space. So, you know, just quick show of thumbs, you know, just throw some thumbs up if this makes sense and you remember what we're talking about here, just so I know that we Gucci over here. All right, cool. Seeing some thumbs up here. Appreciate y'all. Thank you. Thank you. Great. Make me feel like I know a thing or two and explain it kind of well. So cool. And then lastly, we talked a little bit about, okay, well, if you're like a modern web developer and you're trying to work on a full stack, how would you work on the front end and the back end? And I mentioned on the front end, right, it's always going to come back to learning some HTML and CSS. In this particular kind of set of talks and like walkthroughs, I'm going to go over HTML and CSS, but trust me, it's not the kind of thing that you want me to spend all the time talking about HTML and CSS, because there's a lot of resources on HTML and CSS, and I'll show you some of them that are some of my favorites. But HTML is like one of those types of things that you learn more about HTML as you try to build out sites and you think about what it is that you want to put on the site, and you're like, what HTML element can I use to do blah blah blah. Like, for instance, if I was working with a site that I wanted to make a site that embedded videos or did live streaming or something, right? I might look up what HTML elements are good for videos and live streams. And then I would find that there's a video element in HTML and I can make the video respond to live streams, et cetera, et cetera. And there's HTML elements for so many things. And I'll show you that in a second. Similarly with CSS, styling can be both fun and also super challenging. And it really depends on the use case, what you're trying to style, to determine what CSS rules are the best rules to use. Again, we're going to talk on these topics, especially next week when we talk about how JavaScript interacts with these two things. But just remember that when we talk about front-end programming, we're always going to end up talking about HTML and CSS in the web, because that's what really gets transferred. That's what the user sees, is the HTML, which I like to think of HTML as like the skeleton of your web page, right? It's the bones. It's like, I have a joint here, I have a joint here, I have a joint there. CSS would be kind of like the style, right? And so it's like, oh, like, you know, I this tall, or like, you know what I'm saying? Like all of the descriptive elements of the HTML as it relates to where it's supposed to be, how it's supposed to look on the page is the CSS. Then I like to think of JavaScript then as the brains, right? Like it's the logic, it's the action, it's the after this happens, I want this to happen, is JavaScript. Anytime you want a site to be interactive and do dynamic things that are beyond the scope of just style changes, JavaScript is really what you need to use. And that's why you always think about, when the front end, like, you know, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. That's why you hear people talk about HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And so that's really that's what makes JavaScript an important programming language to learn. But there's a number of web programming languages that you can learn. Java is one of them, PHP, Python. And, you know, there's reasons and times to learn different languages, right? And, you know, I personally right now, these days, I'm doing a lot of work in JavaScript and Python, but there have been times where I've you know, written a PHP script because of something I needed to do. Or, you know, people wanted to create a Java-based API backend and use Java for the backend, right? So there's all types of use cases for different languages. Hopefully, when we start talking about JavaScript more specifically, you see the reasons why it is a popular language is because, you know, you can seamlessly go from coding your front end and then going into coding on the back end, which makes it pretty cool. Last point to make is that there's a number of different frameworks for working on the front end and the back end. And in order to be kind of present with web development these days, it really revolves around you learning some of those frameworks and libraries and tools. And so Angular, React, Vue, those are just JavaScript libraries that make coding on the front end easier. And on the back end, there's things like Node.js or Django that make it easier to code on the back end, just, you know, whether you're coding in JavaScript or if you're using Django, coding in Python or something. And yeah, so that's like a little overview of what we talked about last time. I see some stuff in the chat. I like that. Yeah, you know, HTML the bone, CSS the skins, JS the muscle. I like that. Like that. Go ahead, Hafiz. Go ahead, bro.
Okay, so just quick question. So as much you mentioned in the last class that there are multiple framework used in today's market. So in this case, like whatever we can see that front end purpose like Angular, React, and Vue, and for backend Node.js and Django. I mean, how you say these?
Yeah, Django.
Django. Okay. So besides this, what's the difference like Spring Framework or Spring Boot Framework, or there are multiple frameworks, like why when they are moving to a Spring Framework or a Spring Boot Framework, there are also different kind of methodology company use. So waterfall, agile, I know those are the different things for software development, but I'm just to just like know in depth of software development. That's my curiosity. So would you please explain that in details a little bit?
Yeah, I guess like the essence of the question, and I'll break it down for some folks who maybe don't understand everything that you are saying, but Hafiz is talking about the fact that there's so many different frameworks out there. He mentioned two very particular ones that are Java-based frameworks called Spring and Spring Boot, right? And the essence of the question is like, how do you know what frameworks to use in what moments and what environments? And, you know, there's no real easy answer to that question. I think it comes down, one, to like what the situation calls for, right? And the situation might be things like, what is the rest of the code written in? Or what other tools are you using, and what languages are they written in, right? If you're using some other Java libraries, it might make sense to use a Java-based backend because it'll just be easier to, you know, to code the whole thing. Secondly, you know, outside of just like, what is the situation call for? You have to really understand at the end of the day, developers are people, you know what I'm saying? Engineers are people, just like you and me, like, you know what I mean? So,
right.
So people like vanilla ice cream, some people like chocolate, you know what I mean? Like there's no real difference between them outside of the taste or the flavor, what it offers. Some people choose specific things because of the documentation that it has. And is it easier to read if I get an error? Like, so you don't want to get, you never want to get caught up too much on the frameworks as much as you want to understand what's going on behind the scenes, right? Django and Flask, those are two example frameworks that are used in Python for making a server, right? And some might argue I like Django more. Some might argue I like Flask more. Some might argue I like doing it myself and building it out with my own Python code, right? It really depends on who you are, what the situation is, and what you're trying to do. Companies typically make decisions based on whoever their lead developers were, right? So if the lead developer from 20 years ago said, we're going to do it all in Java, that's why now, 20 years later, most companies still use Java, you know? It's harder for them to modernize their applications or completely overhaul them over time. So typically they get stuck in whatever the programming choice were at the beginning. And that goes into like why it's important to architect your applications in a to think through what your decisions are before you start coding. And we'll talk a lot about all of those things. My whole point with like talking about React, and we'll see specifically next week when we start coding more, web stuff with JavaScript. All of the things that are happening with React are regular things that happen in JavaScript. It just so happens that React makes more of those things easier. So if you really want to get good at React, technically what you want to get good at is JavaScript. And that's the case for any framework. If you want to get really good at a specific framework, you want to get good at the language that is underlying it and understanding what goes on behind the scenes. We'll see with the JavaScript stuff that there's a lot to do when it comes to learning JavaScript. It's a pretty involved language. Again, it's not too complicated in my mind. I think, I started off learning like C++ and I thought C++ was crazy complicated. But compared to that, working with JavaScript is a little easier. And so, getting good at JavaScript just comes from time and experience, and knowing those fundamentals will make you better at, I want to learn Angular now, or, I want to learn Node and Express and all those other frameworks that are being created these days. Does that answer your question?
Yes. So whatever I got, I just want to add it. Like, is that required? Is it required? So whatever the business requirements, it came up from the, comes from the client. So is that depends on the frame? The frameworks depends on the business requirements, or is that client's requirement that, hey, this is my application and I want to use this kind of framework because these are the thing I like it, and I want to just proceed on with this. So is it work like, does it work like that?
It depends, sometimes it'll depend on the client telling you this is what you got to use. Sometimes it'll depend on the business use case of what you're trying to do in general. And so depending on where you work and how you work, it'll be up to that'll be what changes which of those two it is.
Okay. Thank you.
Nice.
Thank you
problem. Very much. Yeah, no problem. Groovy. Cool. So everybody else, we good here with like kind of this overview of the stuff we talked about last time on this web dev journey. All right, cool. I see some thumbs coming up. Got it. All right, cool. Dope. Last thing we talked about, just to review, was we did a little live demo. We talked about the Google Chrome developer tools and like how to use the Chrome developer tools to see some of the stuff we talked about. We'll probably see that in a second when I start going over some JavaScript stuff, how the Chrome dev tools come up and work and whatnot. And yeah, let's learn some JavaScript, y'all. So I'm gonna switch gears here and first talk about like, how I would prepare for working with JavaScript and like writing some JavaScript code out. And I'm going to show you two ways that we can start working with some JavaScript just for the sake of class today. And for some of y'all, it'll be good to just kind of use this method to get started. But then others, it'll be like, okay, like I want to spend some more time. So I'll show you kind of the setup that I think is important for working with JavaScript. So let me switch gears here. And pull up this tab. Cool. All right, y'all. So now that that's over, I'm going to just show you kind of like the text editor that I recommend you use to write out some JavaScript code, which is Visual Studio Code. Visual Studio Code is a code editor that is really popular and free. It's a free code editor that you can use to start writing your code. And essentially, it allows for you to define your code, type it out like kind of how you would expect to type anything out in like a Word document, right? You just type out what you need to type out. And VS Code has a number of different extensions to it that allow for you to run your code inside of this one area. It also builds in a lot of functionality, like being able to check your terminal, which becomes really important when you work with web dev code, to like see the output and stuff like that. So if you don't have like a editor that you particularly use all the time, and like this is your first time learning JavaScript, or your first time working at code outside of like Eclipse, for instance, if you were a student and all you used was Eclipse, I would recommend downloading a code editor. VS Code is my preference, but there's a lot of other good ones that are out there in the market. I basically will show you kind of like how VS Code functions in the sense of what we would be talking about in a JavaScript context. So opening up VS Code right now is going to open up actually to some random code. Don't mind the random code, y'all. I was debugging some Git merges that went haywire. If y'all work with Git before, y'all know the vibes. It went crazy. It was like, that's not the vibes here. So if I was to think about like what VS Code is doing simply, it's just a text editor, right? So I could write, you know, a whole novel on I could write a whole novel on here, you know what I'm saying? The whole idea of VS Code is like a normal text editor. So how you would expect Microsoft Word or any Google Docs to work, right? You type your characters and you see it on the screen. This is a graphical user interface for just writing out anything, or regular text files, or any type of file that is using text as a medium. And one of the reasons why I particularly like VS Code is because, as you can see here at the bottom, on the bottom right-hand side, there's a number of different language modes that you can customize VS Code to work with. So I'll just shout out a couple of the ones that are relevant to what we're going to be doing in this class. So there's some HTML. So if I told VS Code I'm working with HTML, now it'll know that I'm working with HTML code and help me out by doing some code completion in specific ways, right? It also has CSS, so same thing for CSS. And then if you scroll down a little bit, it also has JavaScript. It even goes even deeper with React-based JavaScript too. So if I were to just say, hey, you know, VS Code, I'm going to work with some JavaScript right now. Now I have an entire environment configured for me to type out my JavaScript code, and it comes with some built-in features that allow for me to know if I like make a mistake somewhere, or you know, if it picks up that something's wrong with the syntax. So VS Code and using a text editor is one of the ways that you can start writing JavaScript code. Of course, you could use a text editor like this that is like an application that you download. So if you wanted to download VS Code, all you'd have to do is go to code.visualstudio.com. And based on whatever type of computer you have, it'll give you the download URL, or the download link, excuse me. And it'll just download on your computer. And once you have it downloaded, then you'll be able to open it up and see a screen kind of like this. All I did was click new file when it opened up, and then it gave me this untitled JavaScript folder file. And some of the things that I like about VS Code, why I personally like to use it, is it has an integrated terminal inside of it. So if I wanted to open a new terminal, which, you know, we'll explain why that's important to do at different moments, you can use the terminal strictly in VS Code versus having to do it in externally. So that plus like all of the extensions that it has. So it comes configured with like a huge amount of different extensions. And you can see that I have some already, you can see I already have some installed, but all those extensions come in handy when you're working with different types of code that to make your life a little bit easier. Give me a bit and I'll answer your question, brother. So with VS Code and JavaScript in general, we use files to describe the code. So in this case, what I would be doing here is defining what we would call a JavaScript file. And so that's one way to write JavaScript, is to create a JavaScript file, right? And so if I were to save this code, right, it's saying untitled1.js. And so this is interesting to note is that JavaScript files, just like Word docs have the .word at the end or text files have the .txt, JavaScript files have a .js at the end. So if you ever see a file that says .js, you know you're looking at a JavaScript file. I can save this file however I want. I'm gonna save it actually in a I'm gonna save it in a place that low-key makes sense. So let me save it in an actual place that makes sense. Let's see. Cool. So I'll say call it main.js. And so now I have a file, I call it main.js. And now I can start typing all my JavaScript code in here. And so we're gonna go over some of the basics of JavaScript in a second. But I did wanna show you one other way that you can follow along if you're gonna follow along with some of the JavaScript stuff that we're doing. But go ahead, Hafiz, you got a question.
So I would like to know, while I was trying to download the
VS Code
Studio, so in that case, it shows like one is stable, another one is insider. What's the difference between that?
Great question. So there's some versions that are stable, and then there's other versions that are like that they release for you to test, but they're not fully developed with like checked out for bugs and stuff like that. So they have the latest version, but they have the most stable version. So I always recommend downloading the stable version of your software so that you know that the problems that you have aren't going to be because, hey, like, VS Code rolled out some new feature that they're still working on, right? So the stable build is always saying, this is the build that we've tested and we know we can confirm is most up to date.
Thank you.
Yep. No, great question. So yeah, VS Code and text editors are one way for us to start working with JavaScript and, get in this environment together so we understand where we would like work with JavaScript is going to be important. There's actually a couple different ways that you can write JavaScript. So what we're going to talk about today are two of them, and I'm going to show you one other interesting place where you can write JavaScript. And all throughout the next couple of classes, we're going to talk more about all those different locations and why would we want to write JavaScript where and all of that. And so the second location, this is going to seem a little kind of crazy, but say, for instance, I go to a random website. So here's a random website of mine that I made a long time ago. You know what I'm saying? This is my little fresh little high school fit. You know what I'm saying? I feel like Pharrell sometimes. I haven't aged out here. But on this website, remember when we looked at the Google Chrome developer tools? So I'll close this and show you all that again. To open up the Chrome developer tools, you can right click and then you can click inspect and that'll bring up the inspector tool, or you can go up to the view tab and click developer and open up the JavaScript console. So there's a JavaScript console built into your browser. Google Chrome is a good browser to use the developer tools that has this. Firefox has it. Safari has it too, but Google Chrome by far is the easiest browser to use the JavaScript console in my opinion, as a developer that's just getting started, right? Don't mind this error that's talking about my favicon. I don't have one, so it's giving me a little error on this old site. But now that I'm in the JavaScript console, this is also a space where I can write some JavaScript code. So, here in the console is normally where we would look at JavaScript that's running on a website and then see some of the output here and also write some JavaScript to interact with a website that we're currently on. So I'm going to show y'all the first kind of like JavaScript like important thing to know, like everyone wants to know all the time, is how to work with JavaScript. And so the first big lesson you learn at any time you're coding is how to print, right? So I'm going to do this one in the console because there's actually one more step we need to take with VS Code for us to get it to work the way we would expect it to. I'm going to show you all how you would print something in JavaScript. So the print command in JavaScript is really interesting. There's a function called console log. Console refers to this console, and it's saying .log is saying log something to the console. So it's a function. So we have this parentheses, and inside of these parentheses, I'll pass some data. Like you can see the console is helping me fill in the blanks. So inside of a console log, I can pass some data. So I'm going to say, hello world, typical example kind of vibes. And when I press enter, you can see I get this hello world, right? And it says, hey, hello world, from this print that I ran. And there's a couple of interesting things that are going on here. One is that when we normally do console log, we're talking about this particular console. So in a way, it's kind of redundant to do so, but what we're doing here is we're saying, hey, tell this console that we're currently in to log hello world. As we get more advanced with our JavaScript knowledge, we're going to see how we can actually run JavaScript functions and code strictly in this console and have it work in some interesting ways, just off rip. We wouldn't need to even use this kind of console format. But console log is how, if we were inside of a file, for instance, if I'm back in my main.js file for VS Code, console.log would be how I would print something in a JavaScript context. So I'm going to just show it to y'all real quick, and then I'm going to help y'all get set up on your end with the one more thing that you need to be able to run your JavaScript. So I'm just going to type console.log, and I'm going to say hello from VS Code. All right. And I'm going to save this file. So I Command S to save. And in order to run JavaScript code that's not in the browser, you need to use a package installed on your computer called Node. And the reason that this isn't going to work for y'all right now is because we haven't installed Node. So we're going to go through that process in a second. But for me, I have it installed. So I'm going to just show y'all this. I just got to make sure that I'm in the right folder for the code to run. Don't mind me. So I saved this file in a specific place. So I'm just navigating to the folder so I can call this file. But essentially, now that I'm inside of the folder that has the code in there, I can say node main.js and run this JavaScript code. So Node is a package that we install on our computer that allows for us to run JavaScript code outside of a browser. Remember last time we talked, I said the JavaScript runtime is built into our browser. So it can run JavaScript just from the console like we just saw. But if we were trying to run it without a browser open or without like kind of some active site open, in order to use JavaScript and write and refer to it, we need to install Node. So I want to walk y'all through those steps of installing Node real quick, because that's the first thing that you need to do in order to be able to write your own JavaScript files and run them yourself. So if you want to install Node, you can just type Node into Google, and the Node.js website should pop up. It's called nodejs.org. And you should see also, similar to how it was with VS Code, some download instructions for your particular machine. I'm on a Mac, so it knows that I'm on a Mac OS. And so it'll give me two options. Again, what you might want to install is the long-term support stable version of Node versus the latest, because the latest is always just released for developers to test, versus the stable, which is more tested and made sure that everything works as we would expect it to. So navigate to Node on your time and install it. By installing it, if you're on a Mac computer, it should open up and install, and then you can save it to your machine. If you are on a Windows machine, it's going to install on your machine as well. And once you have Node installed, once you go through the installation steps, the best way to go and confirm that you have it installed would be to go back to your VS Code window. And inside of your VS Code window, no matter where you are, you can just type node --version. So note that's 2 dashes. And when you run that, it should come back with some version that lets you know what version of Node you have currently running on your computer. Cool. So yeah, bet. So the two things that you're going to want to do, and this is going to help you just get started with working with JavaScript in general, is to download VS Code so you have a code editor, and then download Node so that you have the JavaScript runtime engine on your local computer so that you can run Node commands on your computer. If we were to look at what Node is, right, we see right here, Node is a JavaScript runtime built on Chrome's V8 JavaScript engine. So we use Node to basically run JavaScript as if it was running on a browser, but inside of our own local computer. So Node is a very important tool. Every JavaScript project that is going to execute some JavaScript, like run a JavaScript file, uses Node to execute those files. So it's one of those things you kind of just have to download and in order to use JavaScript. So I'm paused for a quick second to let y'all download those two things. But don't worry, again, I'm recording the class so that y'all can go back to it and take a look at it, and I'll send you all these resources after class. Cool. No matter if you have it installed or not, I think that what will be cool is to just kind of, let's just do this real quick. Show of hands, how many of y'all have it installed already? Did you get the VS Code and other stuff installed? Got it. Okay, cool. All right, so then I'll just wait and let y'all install it. The installation shouldn't take too long. And then we can go from there. That's actually better. Appreciate y'all. So yeah, you want to download the LTS version. That's the most stable version. You can install Git if you'd like to. We're going to talk about Git in a few, not today, but definitely soon. Yeah, but definitely you're going to want to install Node. You're going to want to install Git. Those two things are important. Cool. If you are raising your hand because you're just letting me know that you got this stuff good, you could lower your hand. That's cool. But if you have a question, you can feel free to ask. Yeah. So yeah, go ahead if you have any questions. No problem.
Professor, I am getting a message like I have downloaded, and it shows that a setup has detected, but the setup is currently running, and it's not resuming.
So you installed and it's just running some can you re-explain what you mean? What's happening?
So I have downloaded in my C drive, and
Right.
I'm trying to install it. It says that the message pop up that a setup has detected that a setup is currently running. Please close all the instance of it now. Then click on OK to continue or cancel to exit.
Got it. Okay. Let's see if you can resolve it on your end, and if you can't, we'll talk a little bit after class about it. Okay.
Okay. Sounds
Yeah,
good.
no problem. Got it. Yeah, and thanks. Shout out to the folks in the chat, helping out with going in there. The command that you want to type to see if you got node running is node space dash dash version. So you can type that anywhere in the terminal to see if it's working. And if you are trying to get in your terminal and you have VS Code open, super easy way is just to click terminal and then new terminal. But y'all can do what works best for y'all. Yeah, you're gonna want to close your VS Code or close your terminal to just make sure that it works. You need to like refresh it to make sure that things are working. All right, cool. Can I just get a show of thumbs of like if y'all got it up or not, and then we can keep it pushing. All right. Okay. Appreciate y'all. All right, bet. Nice, nice. Dope. All right, cool. So, we're gonna keep it light today. We're gonna really go into this stuff a lot more next week. Today, I just really wanted to make sure everyone got set up and we understand just a little bit more of like where we're gonna be going with the JavaScript stuff. So essentially what I'd like for y'all to do is you can open up a VS Code window of your own. So again, the steps would be you could go to File and just click New Window, or a new window should just pop up. And you could create a new file just by clicking New File, and then you can save that file wherever you want it to be. And I ended up creating a file. I call it main.js. I saved it in a very specific folder, but at the end of the day, you can save it wherever you want. The problem that happens if you go through the route of just clicking the new file and going that way is that your terminal is not set up in the place where you made the file. So a super easy way to fix this is if I were you all, what I would do to just get started here, I would go to your desktop, right, and make a new folder and call it like class or something. And like with your class folder or like your CMP 464 folder or whatever folder you want to call it, you can open that specific folder in VS Code by going to VS Code and then clicking open. And when you click open, you can open a specific folder. So in my case, whoops, why is it doing this to me? In my case, the folder I want to open is a folder that I already have created. So I'm gonna open up the specific folder that I want. But for you, it might be that specific folder that you have in your that you just created on your desktop. And when you open a folder in VS Code, you get some security checks that ask you like, hey, do you want to trust the people who made this folder? And then you can say, yeah, because you made the folder. And then you'll see all of the files that you have in the folder already in there. And then if you open the terminal, your terminal will be set to that location already. So if you see when my terminal finally finishes, I'm already inside of that folder. So that's just one way to keep yourself synced up with the right folder. Is really important. A lot of people get errors like just messing around with setting files, but not knowing what folder they're in. You want to make sure you're in the right folder with whatever JavaScript files that you've created. If you are in that file, right? So you can create a new file like the one we were just working on. I made one that's called main.js. And then you can write your first console.log in there, hello from VS Code. And inside of the terminal, then you can run the command node with the name of the file, right? Main.js. And that should run your code. And if you got that running, congrats, you got JavaScript set up to run on your computer, and you're well ahead you're on the right track. You're on the right track. Again, if you get some errors just in the setup, I'll definitely stick around after class and and start talking about those with y'all. But cool.
I
Go
have
ahead.
a question. What was the command to figure out what version of Node you have?
It's node space, so node dash dash version.
Oh, I was doing node dash dash space version. Okay, thanks.
No problem. Dope.
Professor, how did you run the file?
So you want to make sure you're in the you want to make sure that your terminal is set into the folder that you saved your code into first off. So if you want to check in your terminal, you should be able to run the command ls and you should see the files that you made, or in your case, you probably made one file, right? If you're not in that particular location where you save the file, where you save your file, you're going to need to change directory. So use the cd command to go to navigate into where that file is. And once you're in that location, then you can run node with the name of the file. An easy way to check is when you save the file in VS Code and you hover over it, it'll show you the path that you need to be at to see that file. So here you see my path is a really long path because I saved it in a very specific folder. But if I were doing this on my desktop, you know what I'm saying? Like I can show you all this example real quick. Let me just show you a couple shortcuts with VS Code. If I have a folder or a file that I want to open very quickly with VS Code, I could really easily do that by just dragging that folder or file over to VS Code logo. On a Mac, I think that works. On a Windows, I'd be curious to know if that works. But as you can see, I have this file open now for myself, right? Inside of the I opened the folder that has a lot of stuff in it. So let me just do it again. I meant to open this random folder that I just made. So I could open the folder by dragging it like that, or at the top of VS Code, I could go File, Open, and then just find that specific folder that I want to open. On my desktop, I have a folder called Class. So I open that, and then it'll open this folder. And then if you open a folder that has nothing in it, you'll see that this is blank. With VS Code, you can use this icon right here to start a new file inside of this folder. And that's a very easy way to get your project started. You can type main.js or whatever you want to name your file. As soon as you type the .js, you'll see that it turns to saying that this is a JavaScript file. It recognizes that. And then when you press enter, that file should open up on your in your VS Code window. So depending on how you set up your folder and how you open VS Code, you'll have different options for how you can navigate to the file. The benefit of opening the folder though, and this is something that just that people get confused on all the time, so no worries if this is what's happening. The benefit of opening the folder is that when you open the terminal in VS Code, you have it already is in the right folder with the file, so you can see that file there. So again, simplest thing that you can do, just type a console log, hello world. And then you can run it by saying node with the name of the file. All right, just show a thumbs. How many of y'all kind of got that going? And cool, nice. And like I said, I'm gonna stick around. So if anybody has errors at the end of class, we can get through that. I bet. Dope. So this part is important because this is like kind of set up. So I want to make sure that y'all get that. But also, want y'all to take your time with it. The big goal before our next class is to have these things set up for yourself. So I just wanted to show y'all how to do that. And then I'll go through a couple things real quick. And then next week, we're going to just jump right into all the JavaScript that we need to know in order to get going. Cool. So feel free to follow along. So long as you can get the file up, you should be able to follow along with what I'm doing and save it. And then we can troubleshoot getting it to run specifically after class based on whatever errors people are having. So first thing that we just did was we just created our first function in JavaScript. Well, we ran a function in JavaScript, I should say. We ran the console.log function. Console.log is a function that's predefined in JavaScript. This is our print function. So another thing that you're going to probably want to know is how do you leave comments in JavaScript, right? So there's two ways. You can leave a single line comment with 2 slashes, or you can leave a multi-line comment with the slash and asterisk kind of framework like this, right? So however you want to leave a comment, I would just say, console.log, I'll put it correct, prints to the console, right? So this is a very important first function to know, because we use the console.log all the time when we're trying to print some data, print some output. And what we're taking a look at here is this console.log function is printing what we call a string, right? So I'm gonna assume that, for most of y'all have some prior programming experience and understand a little bit more of like kind of programming basics. But I'm still gonna kind of try to go through this for a little bit so that folks can kind of get acclimated with the different data types in JavaScript, and then we'll go in depth on all of them in class next week. So JavaScript has a number of different, just like any programming language, you can use JavaScript to work with a number of different types of data types. And so I'm gonna comment out this console log function with this one line comment, right? So remember, this framework is for multi-line comments. If I wanted to move this to its own line, right? This is for single line comments. So now I'm just gonna make another section real quick of comments, and I'm just gonna say data types. So first one we took a look at is strings, right? Strings are, you could think of them as text or characters we would read, basically, right? So a string is a data type in JavaScript that, if you are familiar with any programming language, we use strings all the time to represent text. Strings are typically wrapped in JavaScript in double quotes or single quotes. So I'm gonna just show you a couple things real quick, and this is just kind of the first foray, and then we're gonna dive into a lot more of it later. So there's a couple different ways to declare a variable in JavaScript, and with these data types, a lot of what we would end up using these data types for is to create different types of variables. Actually, let me zoom in a little bit because I'm sure like y'all can't really see. So we would use these data types to create different types of variables, which is our containers to hold our data, right? So with strings, these are text or characters we would read. So as an example, I might want to create a variable to hold some strings. One of the ways to declare a variable is to use the let keyword in JavaScript. So I can say let first name, set it equal to Cam, right? This is an example of me doing a couple things. Using strings, right, which are these text or characters we read, setting a variable, right? So in JavaScript, there's 3 types of variables definitions that you can use. There's the let variable type, and then there's also a var keyword that you can use. So I can have another variable type called last name, and I can call it flowers, which is my last name, right? And then the last one is const. And I might say, middle name. And I'm giving y'all my government because I trust y'all, you know what I'm saying? Not because I want y'all to steal my identity or anything. So we see 3 different types of variables. And this is something that confuses a lot of people when they first start working with JavaScript, is the fact that there's all types of different syntax for creating a new variable. The var keyword is the first keyword that people normally were using in JavaScript prior to the latest version of JavaScript, which is called ES6. And we'll talk a lot more about what ES6 is in future classes, but think of it as like the last version of JavaScript, right? The var keyword allowed us to create a variable with any name that we wanted to and set it equal to something, right? The let keyword is a newer framework for declaring variables. So typically in newer JavaScript code, you'll see people using the let keyword. Const is the keyword that refers to variables that you set that aren't going to be able to change. So here you see I'm setting middle name equal to Abraham. With a const, I wouldn't be able to change this variable, right? It's a constant variable, what we would call a constant variable. So you see these three things in practice. I just wanted to show it to you real quick so you know. At the end of the day, they're all variable keywords, and you can create a variable with any name that you want it to have, and set it equal to some data. In this case, we're working with strings real quick. First name, last name, and middle name are now variables that I can interact with. So if I want to console log the data inside of any of these variables, I can do that to print it, right? So I'm just going to console log the first name. Again, save this, and then in the terminal, I'm just going to run node main.js. And as you can see, the console log is console logging out my first name, right? I could change this to any of these, and it'll do the same thing. Oops, right? And as you can see, VS Code is pretty cool because it gives you some like quick, shortcuts to like type out stuff that it knows that you're trying to type. So if I do clear again, right? Whoops, I didn't save it. Right, so all three of these have the same kind of functionality. I'm storing a variable, and then I'm able to like use that variable later, right? And printing it in this with the console log. The difference between the let, var, and the const keyword become apparent in usage, right? Vars were the original variable types. We used them all the time. They were able to be used in anywhere in the JavaScript file. The var keyword made by default all of the variables you use global. And that just means that you could refer to the variable anywhere in your file. With the new edition of ES6, we got two new variable keywords that we use more commonly nowadays, which are the let variable, which is the let keyword, and the const keyword. So if we have a variable that we don't want to change, we normally use the const keyword nowadays. And if we have a variable that we're just typically just defining, we'll use the let keyword. So for now, I'm going to just stick to using the let keyword. I just wanted y'all to be aware that those two things, the var keyword and the const keyword, both exist. The let keyword acts like the var keyword in letting you set up a variable that can change, right? So if I want to change my variable to say something else, like, you know what I'm saying? So here in this line 16, I'm creating a variable and setting it equal to the string. On line 18, I'm taking that variable that I created and changing, modifying it. And then on line 21, I'm printing it out for the, so if I clear this and run the node command again, whoops, whoops, didn't change this. Right, you can see that the order operations, I set it to Cam, then it got changed to Cameron, and now I got console logged out first name. And then, yeah, so the let keyword acts like the var keyword. The difference comes up in terms of the scope. And so we'll talk a little bit more about the let keyword versus the var keyword and the const keyword when we start talking about conditionals and functions next week, and loops and stuff like that. The let keyword, what makes the let keyword special is that it can serve as a variable that anyone can use unless it's defined inside of a specific scope. So if it's defined inside like of an if-else statement or inside of a function, then the let has some interesting behavior, which we'll see as we kind of keep going with our JavaScript stuff. So this is just an example of strings, right? Using the strings. Like I mentioned in JavaScript, you can use either double quotes like this, or you can use single quotes. Either way, as you can see, it's gonna run the way that you would expect it to. So it changes camera on right here with the single quotes here. And at the end of the day, it doesn't matter so long as you're consistent. If you start with a single quote, it has to end with a single quote. If you start with a double quote, it needs to end with a double quote. One of the things that kind of that makes JavaScript interesting too is like if you were trying to use a string that had apostrophe. So say instead of first name, I was saying message, and I was saying this is Cam's lesson, right? In this string, you can see I'm using an apostrophe, right, which is technically the single quote. So I have to make sure I wrap this in double quotes so that this is a string. If I were to make this a single quote, right, it's gonna mess up, right? So that's one of the use cases of using double quotes versus single quotes. But typically, there is no real difference between the two. Strings are, super important for just writing out writing text and manipulating text in general. Like I said, we're going to talk a little bit more about it in specifics later. So I'm going to comment this out and keep it pushing. So we talked a little bit about strings, and there are other types of variables that you probably are familiar with already with regards to JavaScript. So we talked about strings. The other data type, that everybody likes to use and ends up being used all the time in our programs are numbers. Integers or floating point, right? So in JavaScript, if I were to be working with numbers, same thing goes. I can create a variable and set it equal to some number. And I'll just, for everything here, we're just gonna let it go. So put this variable in there, and then I can console log it in the console. Oops, my fault. I gotta save this. I keep forgetting to save. In VS Code, you'll know if a file's not saved because there'll be this like white icon that shows that you made a change. And if once you save it, it goes away. So that's how you know, oh, I didn't save this file or whatnot. So now that everything else is commented out, I can console log this particular thing. So I'm just gonna run node main.js, and you can see it's printing my number now. So the console log takes any data type or a variable and prints it to the console for you. And so age is an example of an integer, so a whole number. But if I wanted to create a decimal point number, I could also do that. And you can do it like price or something, 28.18, you know what I'm saying? So change this variable now to price. And now I have this decimal number. And so if I were to rerun my code, node main.js, you get 2818. So with regards to kind of like the types of data, you can expect the types of data that you're normally used to: strings, numbers, and we'll keep it pushing and try to get through the rest of the data types. You might be noticing me do some keystrokes that are pretty interesting, right? Like I just commented all of this out really quickly. In VS Code, I think on Mac, you can do hold command, and press the /, and it'll create a comment for you. So I can toggle between having something commented or not commented in that way. So that's just me doing a keystroke to turn that into a comment if you were curious. And yeah, I'll go over all these tips and tricks as we kind of get into more material. But for now, I just want to keep going through all of the data types so that we kind of are familiar with them. One thing to note is, just like you can in other programming languages, you can use JavaScript to do like arithmetic and those types of operations. So if I say let x equal 5 and let y equal 6, and then I can do like something like console log, or let me do it like this. And then I can say, let z equal 5 plus 6, right? And then console log Z. Just like in any other programming language, JavaScript will perform the arithmetic, right? And so, yeah, all the arithmetic operations, addition, subtraction, multiplication, you can use JavaScript variables just as you would normally expect to use them. And again, I know I'm kind of going through this pretty quickly, but at the end of the day, you know, I'm assuming that you have some basis for your JavaScript knowledge, but if not, don't worry, we're going to go over most of this stuff again next week. So arithmetic, numbers, we're good here, right? If I wanted to, you know, just prove the point one more time, 6 minus 5, right? So all of the arithmetic that you're used to, you can use with JavaScript numbers. So I'll just make a comment. You have you have a plus, you have the net minus, you have times, you have division, you have the modulus, you have all those arithmetic operations that you might want to use are right there. And so numbers are either integers or floating point numbers, depending on what you want to use it for, right? The next data type that is really important for folks to use, of course, are Boolean values, right? So true or false. And so in JavaScript, you can also use Boolean values. So you can say let are we in class equal to true, right? And one thing you might note is the formatting of like kind of how JavaScript how people write JavaScript, right? JavaScript and when people write JavaScript, typically we use camel case to declare like multiple words in something. So, you know, as opposed to saying are like, you know, are we in, you know, class like this is more like how people would do stuff in Python. In JavaScript, we typically write things in camel case. So maybe a better one would be like in class, right? And right now we know, oh, are we in class? Yeah, it's true. Or we could set this to false. Another thing that you might be noticing is like kind of a couple things, right? That might make JavaScript a little bit different than another programming language that you might be used to. In JavaScript, semicolons are optional. So you can write expressions in JavaScript without tacking on a semicolon at the end. If you do put one, it's fine. Sometimes like subconsciously I put one on and sometimes I don't. It just depends on kind of what I'm doing. I used to use C++, so I was used to putting semicolons after everything. You can do it, but it's not necessarily hurting you if you don't have it in most cases. And so with JavaScript, right, we have the Boolean values. So that's like your typical kind of true or false kind of thing, right? So let in class equal false, like in class equal true. And strings, numbers, integers, Boolean values. These are your typical kind of data types that you would expect out of any programming language. The JavaScript is no different. With the Boolean values, then you can start doing conditionals and loops and stuff like that, right? So if I wanted to show you all some expressions, one of the cool things I like about VS Code, actually, let me keep this as a variable. One of the things I like about VS Code is it does a lot of autocomplete for me. So I can do an if statement, right? And as you can see, it pops up with a couple code blocks for me. I can say, oh, if or if else. So this indication, this like box-like thing is saying it can create a code block for you. This like cube is showing that it's a function, and then everything else is like showing that it's a variable. These are like variables, and but with the block, right? If I wanted to see what an if statement looked like and I forgot the syntax, for instance, I could click the code block and it'll put it in there for me. So the way that an if statement works is you say if some condition, then you can run some code, right? So I can say if we're in class, right? If we're in class, if this is equal to true, then we can, do something. Right? And so if I want to set this condition to be like kind of showing you conditionals, you can very specifically check the value or check the type of some variable through JavaScript, kind of like this, right? So you use the double equal sign to do a shallow comparison, to just say, okay, is this variable equal to this value? In JavaScript also, there's another triple equal sign, which sometimes people get thrown off by. The triple equals versus the double equals basically is just saying, not only are these values the same, but are they the same object in essence, right? Do they have the same type and the same like kind of space in a memory based sense, and in a class type sense. So the triple equals is a deeper comparison. So you'll see sometimes people doing both the double equals or the triple equals depending on the scenario. But yeah, typically if you're used to using the double equals to check equality, you can do that in JavaScript. So let me just save this real quick and clear the console and run it again. Right, so it says if this condition is equal to, this Boolean is equal to true, console log, we're in class. I throw the triple equals in there. Let's just see what happens. Right, the triple equals basically is checking not only is this value equal to true, but both this in class and true are set to our Boolean values. They're the same types. There's if conditions, there's also else conditions, right? So with the else condition, you can also run a different type of condition. And here's where you're starting to see some of what I was talking about with scopes and blocks. So the if statement is this statement, right? And then inside of these curly braces is what we would call a code block. This code block executes whatever's inside of the curly braces if this condition is true, right? Else, same thing, we have another code block and this would run something else. Right? So if I were to change this value from this being true to this being false or something, right? What would we expect to run? Well, it's going to come to this if statement and say, is in class equal to true? No, well, we know it's set to false right now, right? So we have the assignment operator and we have the equality operator. The assignment operator, single equals, just basically sets a variable to something else, right? Double equal sign and triple equal sign are all about comparing two values. So that's also something that gets people tripped up sometimes too. But now that we've set this value in class, we set it to false. Well, if in class is equal to true, we're going to run this condition. Else, we're going to run this condition, right? So we know we're going to end up in this block because at the end of the day, in class is set to false. So when we run this, right, it says, oh man, class is over, right? Because it knows that from this condition, it goes through, says, oh, we're not here, so run this condition. And that's kind of how code blocks and the conditionals work, right? We use conditional logic based on true, false kind of things to determine whether or not we execute one thing or we execute something else. I'll tell you right now, in React, we end up using conditional logic, this Boolean logic, quite a bit. Like if something, do this, else do that. We use we use the ability to do that to make some interesting code. Let me just check a second. Triple equal plain role and if you were trying to check multiple values and you had two conditions that you were checking, right? So for instance, let's say in class equals false, and we could say let time equal let's say 9. All right, let's do it as a number just for the sake of this. So let's say 923 is supposed to represent the time, actual time. So let's say if in class is equal to true and some other condition, right? So if I want one condition and another condition, you can still use the double ampersand to create another condition in here. So if I say time is less than 9:30, right? So here I'm saying if this condition 1, and condition 2, right? So basically, if this is true and this is true, right? Then I'm gonna do this. Else I'm gonna do this, right? So if we're in class and time is less than 9:30, then we're gonna console log we're in class. Else, we're gonna console log all man, class is over, and maybe we set in class to true. You know what I'm saying? So I'll set this to true to start. So that's what the double ampersand would do, is allow you to check two conditions. Right, so clearly in class is set to true here at the top, but also 923 is less than 930. So it checks both of those conditions, right? And then it says, okay, bet, cool. Else is gonna say, I couldn't, one of these conditions was false. So I can't really support you. I'm sorry, homie. You class is over, right? Double ampersand is for checking two conditions and saying you want both of them to be true. In JavaScript, if you wanted to check or, you could do this two brackets. And that will show you how to do comparison of one or the other. Cool. So yeah, Boolean values are pretty important because it kind of goes into all of the stuff we know about conditions, and also then it kind of goes into the logic of doing code in certain moments, right? So Boolean logic is pretty confusing sometimes when you first get started. And yeah, we'll talk a little bit more about it, especially in the context of how we would use this logic when it comes to our front end experiences. So we talked about strings, we talked about numbers, we talked about Booleans. So you kind of have a good sense of this. Give me 1 second, bro, and I'm gonna come back to the questions real quick. So we talked about strings, right? Strings are just values that are wrapped in some quotes. We talked about how strings, you can use double quotes or single quotes, right? So that's just basic string notation in JavaScript. We talked about numbers, right? In JavaScript, you can use integers or floating point numbers. So here's an example of floating point number. Here's an example of integers, right? So seeing 5 and 6 and stuff like that. We talk about Boolean values, so true or false. You can set variables to be true or variables to be false. The point you would use those for are for conditionals and checking the conditions of things. JavaScript uses the same syntax for as many other languages. So and then for to multiple conditions. And yeah, we talked about console log, which is our ability to print. And so as you can see, we're printing all types of different things here. We're printing some of the strings. Sometimes we're printing the entire variable itself, right? So console log takes in any type of data and allows for you to print that to the console. One other quick thing I wanted to talk to you about with VS Code is the fact that VS Code has some smart kind of tools embedded. So if you hover over something like console log, for instance, it'll give you the syntax for what you can use it for and what you can call it for. Here it says, hey, it takes in data of type any, so you can pass, you can also pass an array of data. So you can list out the data you want to have the console log print. And just to kind of make sense of some of the stuff I was talking about earlier, right? When I was saying like, here we're using this text editor to write out some JavaScript code. And at the end of the day, we're using Node in the command line to run the JavaScript code, which is really important. We use Node to create a runtime environment for JavaScript. But like I mentioned, in the browser, there's a console built for JavaScript already there. So some of those same things I was doing, I can do here, right? If I want to say message, I can set a message here that says, hello from the browser, right? And now inside, don't worry about it saying undefined here, but now that I've done this and set this variable, I can console log it technically, right? I could say console log message, right? And the JavaScript console knows what we're talking about. So I can write all these JavaScript, same things I'm doing in the files, I can do from the console, which is pretty interesting. The reason it's saying things like undefined and stuff is because I'm calling the console from within the console, and it's kind of like not too sure what you're talking about here. And then so technically, while you're in the console, you don't need to say console.log. You can actually print. You can actually just log variables by just typing them, right? So I can type message, which was defined up here, and say, okay, cool. You know what I'm saying? So I wanted to show you that real quick. Next class, what we're going to talk a lot more about are like more of the functional aspects of JavaScript, using loops, using functions, stuff like that. But we're going to talk about it more in the context of building it out in a very practical sense. So I'm going to send over some resources that are going to help y'all kind of go over this. One of my favorite resources for learning JavaScript in general is the W3 schools. So I wanted to show y'all this website, and I'll post it in the Slack for y'all. The W3 schools is a really dope website with a lot of reference for web development, specifically web development stuff. So you could go to the W3 schools and under and go to their JavaScript tutorial. And inside they have all of the stuff we talk about. If you start from syntax and go down, it'll give you insight on all of the stuff that we're talking about, right? So setting variables, using the variables, et cetera, et cetera. And it'll go down. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about some of these other things in our next class, functions and loops and stuff like that. But just trust me that this resource is really dope because it has so much packed into one website. But yeah, y'all, I know that we're kind of pressed for time. That's my fault. I should have asked y'all to install this stuff earlier, and then we wouldn't have had to waste so much time with the installation. But I'm glad we did it this way, so y'all know what to install and how to use it. So appreciate y'all for sticking by. If you already had it installed, I know that might have been annoying to do that process over again. But yeah, I'll send some resources in Slack for y'all to take a look at. Starting Monday, we're gonna kind of kick off class for real. Now that kind of like our onboarding week and we have JavaScript set up, now we can kind of get into the content a little bit more specifically. So cool. So for those of y'all who can and have questions, oh yeah, we don't have class on Monday. I don't know, did they cancel class on Wednesday also because of the holiday? I'm not too sure. But we'll figure it out and I'll talk to y'all about it in Slack. If you fix the Slack link, yeah, I'll fix the link. No problem, I'll send that over. And yeah, thank y'all so much for your time. If you have a question, feel free to stick by and I'll stay around and help you out with everything.
Professor.
Yes, sir.
The YouTube link it will stay there, right? YouTube?
Yeah. I'll send y'all the link to that too.
All right, thank you.